Today we have a special episode of In the Name of the Law. We will discuss the big changes about to go into effect under our auto insurance law. Don't miss this episode.
Welcome to a special In the Name of the Law with your host, Lisa Speaker from Speaker Law Firm. Joining her today is Steve Sinas from Sinas Dramas Law Firm to discuss Michigan's new NoFault auto insurance law.
Welcome to In the Name of the Law. We have a special episode for you today about the new NoFault legislation. I have with me Steve Sinas, who's an attorney at the Sinas Dramas Law Firm, and he also teaches the class on the Michigan NoFault insurance law at Michigan State University College of Law. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know there's a lot to talk about with this new law, so let's start with the basics. What is NoFault insurance, and does it still exist following these reforms?
Yeah, so many people have heard about the fact that our no-fault insurance law was changed or reformed last year, and that's true. There are many different parts of these changes to understand, but the focus here today is that the law that was passed last year will now allow insurance companies to sell various options of no-fault insurance to consumers as of July 1st, 2020, so just a few weeks from now. And so consumers need to understand what these options are all about, and we're going to talk about that here today. Getting to your question about what no-fault insurance is about, no-fault insurance is just one part of your insurance premium. If you look at your insurance declaration page, which is that page that you get from your insurance company when you buy insurance, you will see that there are various line items of coverage. You can find one for personal injury protection or no-fault insurance. And what that coverage does is it provides you and your family certain benefits if you are injured in a crash, and those benefits are payable to you regardless of fault. That's why they call them no-fault benefits. So we're going to talk more today about what the specific rights of people injured in auto crashes are through the no-fault system. But people have to understand that this is just one part of their auto insurance coverage, and that this form of insurance will still exist under these reforms, and that some of the benefits remain unaffected by these reforms, but that the benefit that is the most affected is the medical expense benefit. And we'll explain how the options consumers will now have available to them will be to limit their medical expense coverage. And that requires a lot of thought and consideration if you're going to do that. And we're going to talk about how maybe that's not such a good idea and that you need to continue with a lifetime coverage. But let's talk more about what the actual basic legal rights are of injured people before we get to those details.
Okay, so let's just get right into it. How would you summarize the rights of a person injured in an auto crash?
So when I talk to people who have been the unfortunate victims of an auto crash, they're all in a state of shock. They're injured. They want answers about their rights. And we have to sit down with them and explain to them a pretty complicated system. And the system that we've had over the last 40 years allowed me to have a conversation with people that in some respects is not going to change under these reforms. But for certain people, it will change very significantly. So let me give you an idea about how this conversation goes. When somebody contacts me after they've been injured, I have some questions for them. First of all, I ask them if they're a Michigan resident or if they're not. And we'll talk more about the different rights of out-of-state residents, but if you're a Michigan resident, I want to first determine that. And if you are, the next question I ask is, well, how exactly were you injured? And if I hear that they were injured on a motorcycle that was, say, hit by another car, they're going to have certain rights that are different than those who are injured in an auto accident. So the first question is, what vehicle were you in? And if you're in an automobile, I will then go on to say, well, you will definitely have no-fault insurance benefits available to you. And certain motorcyclists will have those benefits available to them if they're hit by an auto accident, or I'm sorry, an automobile. But if there's not an automobile involved, the motorcyclist will not get these benefits. And here's what they are. There are three main benefits available to people who are injured in an auto crash. You have your medical expense benefit. This benefit is known as the allowable expense benefit. This covers your reasonable needs for the care and recovery of your injuries. And so this is the centerpiece of Michigan NoFault. And even if you're at fault, you get these benefits. So the first question is, are you injured in a crash involving an automobile? If the answer is yes, then you are going to have no-fault benefits unless you might be disqualified, which could come up for people who are driving an uninsured vehicle they owned, or if a stolen vehicle. There's some limited scenarios where people can be disqualified. But by and large, these benefits are available to people, and they're still available to people under the no-fault reforms. The biggest way in which the reforms change people's rights is that it lets people buy something less than lifetime medical expense coverage. So when I say the conversation with people will be the same in certain respects, I'm going to tell people that we're entitled to the medical expense benefits in a crash prior to these reforms. The same thing, you have those benefits. But what I'm going to then have to ask people is, what type of no-fault insurance coverage did you buy? Did you buy lifetime, or did you buy a limited no-fault insurance policy? And if it's limited, we then are going to have to tell them that their coverage for their medical care and rehabilitation is going to have to be formed and based around what limitations they have on their coverage, meaning they might run out of resources. I represent people who have severe brain injuries and who are paralyzed, and they don't know what to do. And if they're the people who are going to buy that less than lifetime coverage, and we'll talk more about the various limitations allowed under the law to be sold, but if they're buying a policy that's capped at a few $100,000, by the time they get out of the hospital, they're not going to have any more resources. And so the question becomes, with their medical expenses, if they run out of no-fault benefits, what can they do to recover the uncovered medical? And this law allows people to sue each other for uncovered medical.
Which we weren't really able to do before, right? I mean, or at least in a very limited context under the old law.
That's a very good question, and that's true. And see, this is where the reforms create a new system. It still is the case that we have no-fault insurance, but no-fault insurance is the idea, at least here in Michigan, it was the idea that we all would have the lifetime benefit as part of our no-fault benefits, and we wouldn't have to sue each other for medical. And in fact, under the old law, we couldn't sue each other for medical. So now what we have here is a system where people can make these decisions that we're going to get into more greater detail to limit their medical expense coverage. And if they need more than that, they can go after anyone else who may have contributed to the crash and sue them for their uncovered medical expenses. And that's a huge new aspect of this law. So in trying to summarize the other two benefits that make up no-fault benefits, you have the medical expense benefit. And like I said, it's the major benefit. It's still there, but it's going to be limited for people based on their insurance buying decisions. The other benefit is work loss, and that benefit was not changed by these reforms. And this benefit provides people money for loss of income from work they would have performed if they were not injured by the motor vehicle crash. So if you are injured and you can't work anymore, you can pursue work loss benefits. These are capped for 3 years following your crash, and they're capped at 85% of your gross income. And there's actually a statutory max that's about $5,700 right now a month. So if you're injured, regardless of fault, even if you caused the crash, part of your no-fault benefits remains, even under these reforms, this ability to claim work loss benefits that covers this loss of income I just summarized. And then the other smaller benefit for people who survive a motor vehicle crash is known as the replacement service benefit. And that's limited to 3 years following the crash. And that gives you compensation to help pay for people to do things around your house that you can't do any longer, such as your laundry, vacuuming, mowing your yard. So that's a benefit that remains available even after the reforms, and that's at $20 a day. So to summarize on the no-fault side of things, when people are injured, I'm going to ask them, how were you injured? Were you a Michigan resident? If the answer is yes, I'm going to ask them some questions to make sure they're not disqualified from no-fault benefits. And if I determine that they're not, they're going to get medical expense coverage subject to their insurance buying decisions. And then they're going to get work loss and these replacement services. And then they have some other important rights to understand against the at-fault driver.
Okay. You said there are certain scenarios where people injured in a crash will be forced to recover benefits from a different policy than their auto policy. Are you referring to suing the at-fault driver, or are there other scenarios that we're talking about?
The thing about these reforms is that it allows you to go in and buy your own auto insurance policy that has limits on the medical expense coverage, as I discussed. And the other rule that is still part of the no-fault law, even after these reforms, is that when you're injured, the general rule is you turn to your own insurance policy. So if I take my car out and I'm in a crash and I'm injured, I am going to be entitled to no-fault insurance benefits, and I'm going to claim them through my own insurance company. That's the general rule.
Okay.
But there are certain exceptions to that rule. Say if you're injured on a motorcycle. So as I was trying to summarize before, if you're injured on a motorcycle and it doesn't involve an automobile, you're not entitled to those benefits I just summarized. Say if you just went off the road on a motorcycle and you spun out and there was no automobile involved, you would not be entitled to no-fault benefits. But if a car hits you, you are. But the question becomes, well, who pays your no-fault benefits? And the result under the law, as it stands now, is that if the motorcyclist is hit by that car, and that motorcyclist, say, had the lifetime medical expense coverage, the law has this odd reality to it where the motorcyclist doesn't get the benefit of their insurance buying decision. In fact, they get their benefits from the car that hit them. So if they happen to be hit by a car that has a very limited medical expense coverage, the law says they get benefits from that policy subject to their limits. And that is a very unfair result for a motorcyclist who is paid for the lifetime coverage and can't access it just because of the way the law is written. And so that's an example. There's one other example that comes to mind. If you're injured in an employer-owned vehicle, say you take your vehicle home for the night, you put your family in it, and you go to a restaurant, and you're hit at an intersection, and everyone's injured. The law, again, has this odd reality to it where even though you're not on the job, the fact that you and your family were in an employer-owned vehicle, you will claim your no-fault benefits from your employer's insurance company. And before the changes went into effect, it always had to be lifetime coverage that everybody bought. But if your employer decides to buy a limited policy, you're going to be stuck with those limits, even if you chose to insure your family with lifetime coverage under your own policy. So there are many ways in which these laws were implemented and the way they were written where not enough input was given, not enough thought was given to these scenarios where you have an unfair result like these, where people who buy the lifetime coverage don't get it just because of how they were injured.
What about someone from a different state? If they're injured in an automobile accident in Michigan, what are their rights under the new law?
Under the reforms, what's happened here is that it says that for out-of-state residents, they are automatically disqualified from recovering these things called no-fault benefits that I've summarized, unless they have registered and insured a vehicle here in Michigan. So the people you're talking about who would actually register and insure a vehicle here in Michigan are people who, if they're out-of-state residents, they somehow have some situation like a house here or some reason why they're keeping a vehicle here, even though they live out of state. So it's a very small class of people that are not disqualified, which means that any of your family members and friends who come from out of state and are visiting you, if you are in a car crash with them here in Michigan, they have no right to recover those no-fault benefits I just summarized. Their recourse under the new law is that they must pursue all their expenses, their medical expenses, their lost wages, their pain and suffering damages from the at-fault driver. And if there isn't an at-fault driver, then they don't really have any recourse for those damages. And it's really unfortunate because one thing I always appreciated about the original law was that my loved ones who came from out of state and anybody I knew traveling in from another state, I knew that they were going to have the benefit of our no-fault system and they wouldn't have to be so limited in what their rights are. But these reforms really change what the rights are for out-of-state residents.
What are the rights against the at-fault driver?
Well, as I said, there are certain rights we have with the no-fault insurance system that are based on our no-fault coverage, and that's payable regardless of whether we're at fault or not. If there is a party that's at fault, we have limited rights against them to recover our pain and suffering damages for the way in which our quality of life has been affected by our injuries. And you may remember that I noted that work loss benefits are capped at 3 years. And so if we have work loss or loss of income beyond 3 years, we can pursue that extra income loss against the at-fault driver. And as we talked about, the original no-fault law didn't allow us to sue each other for medical expenses, but now we can for those people who have medical expenses that exceed their no-fault coverage. So they can sue us now for any extra medical expenses based on any ways in which we may have contributed to the crash due to our own negligence. So as consumers, we all now face a much greater financial liability to each other if we ever unfortunately injure one another.
Okay, that's really helpful, Steve. Thank you. You used a phrase a couple of times that I thought was really interesting, the insurance buying decisions of people in Michigan. So tell us, when is the insurance buying process going to change for us?
So the law says that as of July 1st, 2020, insurance companies can offer a whole new menu, so to speak, of insurance coverages for everyone to choose from. So first things first, before July 1st, 2020, insurance companies are not allowed to sell these options. They only begin to be allowed to sell them after or as of July 1st. And so as you're sitting there listening to this and you're wondering, well, do I have to do anything? If you just renewed your auto insurance, your coverage may go through with the coverage you had before, which is the lifetime. And that these choices I'm about to summarize really aren't something you have to deal with until you renew. But I will just say this, I highly recommend everyone call their insurance agent and talk about what we're talking about here today. Because one way or the other, you're gonna have a new menu before you sooner than later. And there are aspects of this system that may give you good reason to go ahead and change certain coverages you already have. So with that being understood, these changes are right on the horizon and everyone needs to understand what the options are. In the beginning of the episode, we talked about the rights of people who are injured under the new auto no-fault law. And so what the no-fault law says, though, that we can do before we're injured is buy auto insurance that has limited amounts or zero amounts of medical expense coverage. And so let me go through the options that we all are going to be presented with when we go buy insurance going forward.
Oh, good. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, and on that note, our agents are obligated to offer these options to us. So there's going to be all these forms that we have to review and disclosures that we're being informed of these options. So what are the options? Well, you can buy an auto insurance policy that has the no-fault benefits that we summarized before, but has limitations on your medical expenses. And for a certain category of people, those who are on Medicaid and have people in their household who have Medicaid or other forms of insurance that would cover an auto accident, meaning the house is insured either through Medicaid or other forms of insurance. There's another level, $250,000 of medical expense coverage. And then there's another level, $500,000 of medical expense coverage. And so you have these various limits. And the way this works is that if you have one of these policies, say you had the $50,000 policy and you and your family of four are injured in a crash, you all are going to have that limit to cover your medical expenses. But once you need something over and above that limit, you have no further rights under the no-fault system. So the idea of a cap is that it's going to cut you off if you need it. The system never had an open spigot of benefits spraying out on people. There was always a need to show you reasonably needed something, but the system before didn't have a monetary cap that would cut people off. Now families that make this decision to buy this limited amount could face that reality. Because of that, you
mentioned earlier that if you have a hospital stay after a serious accident, a person could easily go through $250,000 with a hospital stay, right? That's
right. So one thing I should have emphasized a little bit more before is when you're talking about the medical expenses of an auto accident victim, they can be enormous. And it's the nature in which the injuries are sustained and the damage inflicted upon people's bodies that can result in these people needing long-term hospitalizations, inpatient care. Then after that, they need care and therapies for the rest of their life. So I've seen so many clients greatly benefit from the no-fault insurance system and the lifetime coverage. And so when we're talking about insurance buying decisions, this is a good time to emphasize this. The bottom line is you have all these options to limit your coverage, but you still have the option to buy lifetime coverage. And I couldn't recommend that more, because knowing that a family who's been seriously injured out of nowhere can have a system by which they can rely upon to give them what they need, they're not going to be cut off, that may make all the difference in the world for that family. And so when I'm going through these options, yes, you can have these limited forms of no-fault insurance coverage, but should you get it? I don't think so. It's the lifetime coverage that gives you lifetime protection for you and your family.
So on the same form that has the various options of 50,000 or 250,000, there is a box that says lifetime coverage. That's the box that you're recommending we check, correct?
That's right. And so the issue is, and the concern for those who didn't support these reforms, is that people who are just looking to get a break on their insurance premiums, which is so many people, and it's so understandable, people are trying to save money, that they are going to see these options that are going to cost less than the lifetime coverage and select them because they cost less money, but not because they make a whole lot of sense in terms of what's best for their family. So I urge people to really consider whether or not you really want that savings when you limit from lifetime down to one of these lower limits. And the question is whether you're really getting a good deal for that. I would say that you're probably not. Worse yet, and then let's not forget about these other options that are even worse. They're the opt-out options. And so if you have health insurance that does not exclude auto, and I know this gets real technical, but whether you know it or not, your health insurance either will pay for an auto accident or it won't. Maybe you don't know the answer to that question, but for example, most Blue Cross plans don't have an auto exclusion. Some do, but I've seen a lot that don't. So if you have one of those plans, the system allows you just to opt out of no-fault entirely, meaning that you would be selecting to have health insurance cover all your needs. And here's the reality about health insurance in America. First of all, people can lose it easily if they lose their job. And if they can't afford buying it, then it's hard to get Medicaid because maybe they don't qualify for the, in terms of the financial standards that apply about who qualifies. They can't get Medicare because they don't qualify there. And they're between a rock and a hard place. So people can lose health insurance. Health insurance has limitations that are that seriously limit the care and recovery for certain people, depending on how badly they're injured. And so you don't want to opt out from no-fault entirely. You want to think long and hard before you would select this option. And this option is really confusing to totally cover in terms of all the details, but it essentially allows somebody to go into their insurance agent and say, here's my health insurance, it covers auto, and they say, okay, you don't need any medical expense, no-fault coverage at all. And if they're injured, they're never going to get it. So the other opt-out is for people who are on Medicare. And seniors are looking for a break because of the cost of auto insurance, and that's understandable too. But they basically allowed the seniors just to opt out entirely. And Medicare does not cover long-term needs for people who are seriously injured. So senior citizens basically have this option to jump ship entirely and have no coverage altogether, or they can just pay what they were paying before and have the lifetime coverage, which is what I would still recommend.
This is really important. So not only do we have to pay attention to what we're selecting for ourselves, but if we have parents who are senior citizens, we probably should be talking to them as well.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
And then the other part of this, in terms of the insurance buying decisions, I've summarized the main options with regard to that no-fault coverage. And again, that's that coverage that pays regardless of fault. But as I touched on before, the system now allows us to sue each other. So for all the people out there that are inevitably going to make the decision to save on their auto insurance and buy the limited option, those people, if they're seriously injured, will then have to sue the other drivers involved to get their medical expenses paid. And so we all need to protect ourselves with another form of insurance, which is liability insurance. And that's the insurance coverage we buy in the event we make a mistake and somebody brings a claim against us. So you need to go with the lifetime coverage to make sure you're fully protected for your own medical needs. And then you need to talk to your agent about increasing your liability insurance limits so that you're fully protected in the event you make a mistake and you injure somebody who does not have lifetime no-fault coverage.
Aren't there other coverages that we should be considering as well?
Yes, and thank you for asking that, because again, the name of the game in terms of understanding your insurance is understanding that your insurance is made up of various types of insurance. So we've talked a lot about no fault coverage being payable regardless of fault. We've talked about liability insurance being this insurance that steps in if we make a mistake. You might look at your declaration page and say, well, wait a minute, he didn't tell me about uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage. And I would regret if I didn't tell you about that. So let me take a second and explain it to you. So uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage is protection we buy for ourselves and our families in the event we're injured by somebody who doesn't have liability insurance. So even if you buy the lifetime coverage, you may still want to bring that claim for pain and suffering or the long-term income loss against the at-fault driver. But what if that driver doesn't have insurance? What if that driver doesn't have enough insurance? That's when you and your purchases of uninsured, if there's no insurance, or underinsured, if there's not enough insurance, comes in, and your own insurance company steps in the shoes of the at-fault party and pays the damages as if they were coming from the at-fault party. So it's a way of protecting yourself against all the drivers out there that may cause you to be injured and also don't have enough insurance to fully compensate you. So I highly recommend that people talk to their agents about that. And one critical point about that is that is not mandatory. You can buy insurance and there's no legal obligation for your agent to tell you about that or sell it to you. So you should definitely ask about it and load up on as much of it as you can.
Okay, so the main point is we need to talk to our insurance agent as soon as we can to make sure that we have the right amount of coverage. Thank you, Steve.
That's right. That's right. And if you don't mind, I want to summarize the choices as follows. Buy lifetime coverage, increase your liability insurance limits, and make sure you get as much uninsured and underinsured motorist coverage as possible.
Great, thank you. Does this new law guarantee that our auto insurance rates will go down?
A lot of people think that it guarantees that the total cost they pay for auto insurance will go down by these laws, and that's not true. The law does not guarantee that. It guarantees that if we choose the certain limited options I summarized, that we'll get a discount on the line item for no-fault insurance coverage on our insurance declaration page. But that's just one part of our insurance premiums. Keep in mind, we all now have greater financial exposure if we injure somebody. So liability insurance may go up. In fact, the insurance industry has actually said that those rates may go up. So the savings we get is very unclear. And also understand this, there's a percentage that they say that our no-fault insurance rate should go down by, but it's not a percentage of what you were paying in the past. It's a percentage of the average amount that your insurance company was charging throughout the state of Michigan at the time these reforms were implemented. So the savings is certainly unclear, and I really don't think it's going to amount to what people think it's going to be.
Thank you so much for your input, Steve. It was really helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today for In the Name of the Law. Please go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics, and please join us next week for another informative show.